Zurich Airport, 6:22 p.m. Snow delayed all flights. Oliver Grant, 37, a single dad, sat on a cold plastic bench with his daughter Lily. 5, he was desperately worried about their future, clutching their threadbare luggage. Near them, billionaire CEO Helena Roth, 40, was alone and empty in her sterile VIP lounge after losing her company in a brutal boardroom coup. She was outwardly composed but inwardly shattered. Lily held her last cookie, walked across the sterile tile floor to the powerful woman, and asked, "If I share my cookies, Yam, will you stay?" Helena froze. Oliver Grant, at 37, carried the quiet weariness of a man who had chosen sacrifice over self. He was once a bright, ambitious construction electrician, capable of managing entire site grids, and his work was his pride. But that life, full of long hours and career climbs, abruptly ended 4 years ago. His wife, Maya, was taken by a sudden, aggressive heart condition when their daughter Lily was barely 18 months old. The loss was a seismic event that reshaped his entire existence. Since then, Oliver's focus had narrowed to a single fierce, non-negotiable point: Lily's well-being, physical and emotional. He took on unpredictable hourly contract work, jobs repairing old wires in freezing basements, rewiring sheds, anything that allowed him the flexibility to be the one who picked her up from daycare, the one who cooked her simple meals, the one who read her stories. This choice meant a perpetual state of financial precarity. His savings were meager, perpetually stretched thin by Lily's sporadic medical checks and the relentless cost of living in an expensive city. Just last month, he had faced the agonizing choice of replacing a worn-out tire on his decade-old car or buying Lily the small, sparkling red boots she desperately wanted. He bought the boots, deciding that a confident, happy child was a more critical asset than a smooth ride. Oliver lived with a deliberate, almost ascetic frugality, ensuring that every spare cent went toward Lily's future, or, at the very least, her immediate happiness. His own needs were non-existent. He wore the same 3 shirts in rotation and survived on instant coffee and toast. Yet he never felt deprived. He was fueled by the memory of Maya, who, in her final days, had whispered to him, "Teach her to share her sunshine, Oliver. That's the only inheritance she needs." Lily was his mirror, growing up with very little, yet possessing a heart perpetually full and eager to share. She understood scarcity not as lack, but as a reason to give. Today, that scarcity had become acute. They were en route to Oliver's small hometown in the countryside, a place where he hoped to find cheaper work and a supportive community. He had just been fired from his last long-term contract. The reason? An emergency, unscheduled day off to take Lily to the pediatric cardiologist for a routine but essential checkup. Loyalty and necessity had cost him his livelihood. Their combined bank balance was less than what Helena Roth spent on a single taxi ride to the airport. But Oliver, ever the rock, kept his face cheerful for his daughter, shielding her from the deep well of worry churning in his gut. Helena Roth, in her tailored midnight blue suit, looked like a monument to cold, efficient power. For 20 years, she had been defined by work. She had built Roth Global from a small investment fund into an international behemoth, sacrificing marriage, friendship, and family for the singular pursuit of success. In her VIP enclosure, everything was silent, luxurious, and utterly cold. Her personal assistant, Marcus, was outside, discreetly ensuring no one disturbed her, a professional barrier she had built of glass and steel. But the protection was meaningless now. The boardroom coup had been a masterpiece of betrayal. The men she had made rich had collectively decided she was too volatile, too singular, too female to run the massive empire they now stood to inherit. Her private jet sat uselessly on the tarmac, its engines cold, ready to take her anywhere in the world, yet offering her no destination. The silence in the VIP lounge was deafening, amplifying the sound of her own crushing failure. She had conquered the world, and now the world was spitting her out. She stared blankly, utterly adrift, with no husband, no child, and not a single soul waiting for her arrival back home. When Lily appeared in the doorway of the VIP lounge, holding the small, foil-wrapped cookie, Helena's first practiced instinct was to reject the intrusion, to deploy the chilly formality that kept the world at a distance. She was about to wave the child away, to tell her a polite no, when Lily spoke again, her voice a delicate whisper in the high-ceiling quiet. Daddy says sharing means you won't be lonely. The simple phrase pierced the armored shell Helena had worn for decades. Her world was built on contracts and transactions, but this was a pure offering, an act of faith. Oliver watched from the public seating area, his heart clenching with a mixture of profound pride and aching sadness. He knew that was the last cookie, the final small treat they had for the long journey. His daughter was giving away the last bit of comfort she had to a complete stranger, embodying the very lesson he had taught her, even as that lesson cost him everything. He knew he had to let the moment play out. Helena didn't just accept the cookie. She took the offering as a sacred trust. She unwrapped the chocolate chip treat and took a bite. The unexpected taste of simple sugar and butter, devoid of the complex gourmet artistry she was used to, was startlingly real. A slow, tentative smile touched her lips, a movement so unfamiliar it felt awkward on her face. She gestured to the two plush leather chairs around her, the epitome of quiet, expensive comfort. "Thank you for sharing," Helena said, her voice raspy from disuse, unaccustomed to such trivial human exchanges. "Would you and your father like to sit with me? It's much warmer and quieter in here." Oliver hesitated immediately. His worn jacket, Lily's slightly scuffed boots, the cheap plastic bag holding their meager carry-on, all felt glaringly inappropriate against the backdrop of polished chrome, imported marble, and plush velvet. The class barrier felt insurmountable, a wall built of billions. He opened his mouth to offer a polite excuse, a self-deprecating deflection. Lily, however, had no concept of class warfare or social exclusion. She simply wanted company. She tugged at her father's hand, her expression pure and irresistible. "Just cookies, Daddy," she whispered, the implication being that the transaction had been completed. Now they were simply friends. Oliver couldn't say no to that logic. He smoothed his jacket, took a deep breath, and, with an awkward reverence, led Lily into the exclusive space. The staff positioned around the perimeter of the lounge instantly stiffened, their training screaming at the unauthorized breach of protocol, but none dared approach the CEO while she was smiling, an event as rare as the snow outside. The contrast was stark, the billionaire and the single dad, united by a 5-year-old and a shared crumb. The conversation that followed was the simplest, most unburdened Helena had engaged in for 20 years. Lily, uninhibited, launched into a detailed, charming narrative about her kindergarten class. The new finger painting station, the strict rules about glue sticks, and the urgent politics of the sandbox. She drew a crude picture of her rocket ship on a napkin, which was actually Oliver's washing machine with a laundry basket balanced on top. Oliver, finding his footing in the unexpected safety of the atmosphere, spoke about his life with a quiet pride. He described the tricky work of chasing down short circuits, the satisfying hum of a newly stabilized electrical panel, and the challenges of teaching Lily that high-voltage wires were for looking at, not touching. He detailed the intricate process of connecting old, crumbling infrastructure to new smart home technology, a complex logistical challenge that involved patience, precision, and an almost artistic knowledge of how energy flowed. Helena listened, truly listened. Her corporate world was filled with buzzwords, leverage, and abstract capital. Oliver's world was tactile, real, and governed by immutable laws of physics. His problems could be fixed with a wrench and a multimeter. Her problems required lawyers and divestiture. She noticed something crucial. Oliver didn't ask her name, he didn't try to place her, and he offered no flattery or deference. He treated her simply as a fellow adult, a person sitting alone in an airport who had received a cookie. A quiet hunger stirred in Helena, a craving for the unburdened simplicity of their interaction. This was validation without valuation. She used the dedicated lounge phone to discreetly call the staff, ordering a selection of hot cocoa, pastries, and a full child-friendly meal for Lily. When the tray arrived, Oliver politely accepted the cocoa for Lily, but gently pushed the remainder of the food back toward Helena. "Thank you, but no," he said, his dignity absolute. He looked at the feast before them, a mountain of food that could feed them for days. She shared first. "We can't ask for more now." That was the extent of the exchange. His refusal was not rudeness. It was a deeply ingrained principle, a code of honor that Helena instantly recognized as a value far rarer than money. Helena's personal assistant, Marcus, appeared then, having finally located his boss after the disastrous boardroom meeting. He surveyed the scene, the CEO of Roth Global seated with a poorly dressed man, a child coloring on a linen napkin, and crumbs, actual crumbs, on the pristine white carpet. His expression shifted from professional concern to sheer snobbish disgust. "Ms. Roth," Marcus began, his voice laced with patronizing disapproval, his eyes darting to the attendant to signal the violation. "Your private transport is ready, and the lounge is quite full of unauthorized guests. The others are getting uncomfortable." Helena, who had just been about to ask Oliver about the voltage requirements for home solar installation, cut Marcus off mid-sentence. Her voice was level, carrying the genuine authority that came not from a title, but from a sudden, fierce protectiveness. "They're with me, Marcus," she stated, her eyes drilling into him. "They are my authorized guests. They are not to be disturbed, spoken to, or acknowledged. Do not interrupt us again." Marcus retreated, stunned into silence by the cold finality of her command, understanding that his power, derived from her title, was momentarily suspended by her whim. The flight delay stretched on. The snow intensified. The small world of the VIP lounge became a temporary bubble of shared humanity. Eventually, the long day and the unexpected excitement wore Lily out. She drifted to sleep, her head finding a comforting, unexpected resting place. She leaned against Helena's shoulder. Helena stiffened instantly. Her body had not been touched by anyone in such an innocent, trusting way for decades. The sudden, small weight felt monumental. Her shoulder began to ache, her arm went numb, and for a terrifying moment, she wanted to flee the intimacy. But the warmth of the child, the innocent, heavy trust, was an anchor. It was the feeling of being needed without being wanted for her money. Helena did not pull away, even as her shoulder grew stiff and painful. It was a profound act of emotional acceptance, and the first time in years she allowed herself to be truly vulnerable. As the hours melted into the deep night, Helena had ample time to reflect and plan. She used the encrypted channel on her phone to discreetly confirm Oliver's recent employment termination, the reason and the bleak reality of his financial state. Helena felt a burning surge of protective obligation, an instinctive desire to fix Oliver's problems with the only tool she had ever mastered: money. She waited until Lily was deeply asleep, nestled safely in the chair next to them. "Oliver," she began, her tone formal, slipping back into her practiced CEO persona. "I have verified your situation. I could ensure you never have to worry about an unexpected expense again. A trust fund for Lily, a stable, high-paying role on my facilities team. Whatever you need, I can stabilize your life permanently." Oliver sat up straighter, adjusting the thin jacket on his shoulders. His eyes were clear, and his resolve was steel hard. "Helena, I appreciate the offer, truly. I know the value of what you're offering, but no, I can't accept it." She was genuinely taken aback, her financial reasoning failing for the first time in her career. "Why? This isn't charity, it's an investment in character, in the kind of person I want around me. I'm offering you complete financial security." Oliver shook his head slowly, patiently, like a teacher explaining a difficult concept. "I don't want my daughter to think kindness has a price, or that her small act of sharing was a transactional ticket to wealth. My integrity and the lessons I teach her, that you give without expectation of return, are all I have left that money can't touch. If I take your cash, I poison the purest thing she did tonight. I have to earn it for her." Twist 1. The shared scars. Oliver's unwavering dignity tore down the last of Helena's defenses. A powerful, painful memory surged forward, breaking through her emotional armor. She saw herself, a lonely 7-year-old girl, sitting alone in a sterile airport corridor after her mother's sudden death during a business trip. Her wealthy, distant father had sent a chauffeur to pick her up hours later, but in those endless, cold hours, no one had stopped to ask if she was okay. No one offered a cookie or a comforting word. The memory was raw, visceral. She remembered sitting there shivering and making a silent, 7-year-old pact. I will never be powerless again. I will be so rich and so important that no one will ever overlook me. That pact was the engine of her entire career. She realized Lily was the embodiment of the child she once was, but a version that was protected, brave, and generous because of her father's simple, deep love. Oliver and Lily had offered her the connection she never received in her darkest hour. The weight of her past, the coldness of her ambition, and the sudden, acute awareness of her own profound, self-imposed isolation crashed into her. The forced sale of her company had stripped her of her title, but Oliver's refusal had stripped her of her protective cynicism. Just then, an attendant entered the lounge with an update, his manner now hesitant after Marcus's retreat. Ms. Roth, the weather has cleared slightly. We have managed to secure a flight for you on a private charter leaving in an hour. We've also prepared the executive quiet room for you. It's completely soundproof and has a full bed for you to rest until then. The announcement shattered the peaceful bubble. Lily stirred and blinked awake, her gaze immediately locking onto Helena. She sensed the shift in the air, the moment of definitive departure. Lily's small voice cut through the silence, sharp with the fear of abandonment. Are you leaving? Helena stood up, the tension in the room spiking. She saw the executive quiet room, a soft, luxurious escape from the cold, hard night. It represented her old life, comfort, exclusivity, and isolation. She looked at Oliver, who was patiently waiting, ready for her to inevitably choose the privilege she was entitled to. He gave a small, almost imperceptible nod, signaling that he understood she had to return to her world. Helena stood motionless for a long beat, caught between the habit of a lifetime and the profound, simple need of a child. She had a moment of pure clarity. The quiet room was the ultimate loneliness trap. Twist 2, climax, the choice to stay. Then with a slow, deliberate movement that felt like a lifetime decision, Helena turned her back on the attendant in the executive quiet room. She walked past the attendant and Marcus, who looked on in stunned disbelief, and returned to the common, hard plastic seating area outside the VIP section. She sat down, not in her comfortable VIP chair, but on the cold, hard plastic bench next to Oliver and Lily. Oliver was speechless, staring at the sight of the billionaire CEO choosing a piece of uncomfortable public plastic over the luxurious privacy of her old life. This was a physical rejection of her entire past. Helena pulled her coat tightly around her, adjusting to the sudden drop in temperature. She looked at Oliver, then at Lily, her eyes warm and vulnerable for the first time. I don't want to be alone tonight, she confessed, the 4 words holding the crushing weight of 40 years of solitude. Her admission hung in the air, a raw, honest confession that stripped away every layer of her professional facade. Marcus, hovering in the doorway, looked utterly defeated, realizing his boss had just chosen humanity over hierarchy. Oliver looked back at her. The quiet gratitude in his eyes was the only currency Helena needed. She had rejected power, wealth, and comfort for a single, fragile connection. The remainder of the night passed in a long, surreal blend of deep exhaustion and genuine connection. Helena, seated on the cold bench next to them, transformed entirely. She became a willing participant in their small, struggling family unit. When Lily became restless, Helena didn't just tell her to be quiet, she engaged. She spent an hour holding Lily, telling her a spontaneous, complex fairy tale she invented on the spot. It was about a lonely queen named Alara, who ruled a crystal castle, but whose heart was made of ice until a tiny warm robin shared its last seed with her. The queen realized the warmth of the seed was more valuable than all the jewels in her kingdom. It was a story Helena had unconsciously written about herself. her voice taking on the melodic quality of a loving mother rather than a ruthless negotiator. Oliver watched fascinated. He realized that the legendary coldness of Helena Roth was not cruelty. It was a deep, protective scar tissue, a defensive shell grown over decades of prioritizing transaction over human intimacy. She wasn't cold. She was simply very, very lonely. The simple necessity of his life, the need to care for someone else, had protected him from the kind of isolation that had nearly consumed her. As the first pale light of dawn began to break through the airport windows, the snow had stopped. The airport came alive, the sounds of baggage carts and intercom announcements replacing the quiet hum of the night. Flights were finally being called. Before they had to separate, Helena pulled out a matte black business card. No logo, just a name and a private number. She placed it gently in Oliver's hand. "This is not a job offer, Oliver. This is just a number. It is my private line. If you ever need advice, if you need a referral, or help navigating bureaucracy, you call. No financial strings. No, just a connection." Oliver nodded, accepting the card for what it was. A truce, a promise, not a debt. The moment of separation arrived. Oliver gathered their few things and Lily ran ahead, then stopped abruptly, turning back to Helena. She looked up at the tall woman with a sudden, serious fear. "You're really leaving now," Lily stated, the realization hitting her. Oliver felt a familiar pang of fear, the attachment, the risk of loss. He worried Lily would be heartbroken when the powerful woman disappeared back into her world. Helena understood his fear instantly. She didn't offer a promise of wealth. She offered a promise of character, the only thing she had left to give that truly mattered. She knelt down on the cold floor, bringing her face level with Lily's, ignoring the stares of the staff. "Yes, sweetie, I have to fly now," Helena said, her voice soft but solemn, her eyes steady. "But I promise you this. I will not disappear without saying goodbye, and I won't go away forever. I'll come back to share another cookie with you soon. You were the bravest person I met tonight." Lily's face broke into a radiant smile, completely satisfied by the solemn promise. She launched herself forward and wrapped her small arms around Helena's neck. "You can stay as long as you want," Lily whispered into her ear. Helena closed her eyes, clutching the child tightly, the simple warmth of the embrace melting away years of icy solitude. She knew in that moment that she hadn't just secured a simple flight. She had secured a reason to be a human being again. The sun rose fully, illuminating the pair as they parted. Oliver nodded his thanks, a genuine bond of mutual respect forged in the quiet hours of a shared crisis. Helena walked toward her gate, but she was no longer the empty CEO. She was a woman who had just realized she had a reason to come back. If you believe kindness can change a life, type, "I will live kindly." A few weeks later, Helena Roth was back in Zurich. She didn't return to the penthouse or the sterile boardroom. She called Oliver, not with the formality of a CEO, but with the cautious uncertainty of a new friend. She didn't offer him a handout. Instead, leveraging her vast network, she found Oliver a stable, full-time position as the lead maintenance supervisor for a large regional charitable foundation, a job that used his high-level technical skills. It came with excellent pay, comprehensive benefits, and, most importantly, scheduled hours that kept him within 3 blocks of Lily's school. It was a job that respected his skill and protected his fatherhood. Oliver accepted, his dignity intact because he was paid for his talent, not his sympathy. More important than the job, however, was Helena's presence. She began to appear regularly in their lives. She never replaced Maya. She became an anchor, a steady, dependable friend. She drove Lily to school in the mornings, sometimes arriving in a discreet electric sedan, sometimes walking with them. She learned about simple pleasures, the joy of finding a perfectly smooth skipping stone, the complex rules of a board game, the quiet, profound peace of a small, shared family meal. Every single time they met, Lily would ask the same question, a joyful ritual. "Do you have cookies today?" And every time Helena would smile, the expression now genuine and easy, bringing a box of simple, home-baked cookies, sometimes slightly burnt, sometimes unevenly shaped, a testament to her newfound awkward humanity. She was successfully navigating the sale of Roth Global, but the stress no longer broke her. She was now fighting for herself, but she had a reason to go home, a place of warmth that was not defined by money. Her power was now rooted in presence, not possessions. The final essential pieces of the puzzle were in place. Oliver had stability, Lily had consistency, and Helena had family. The winter afternoon was cool, but the sun was bright. The three of them sat on a simple wooden park bench overlooking a small, snow-dusted playground. Oliver was reading a manual. Helena was sketching something complicated on a notepad, but it wasn't a corporate structure. It was a design for a new climbing wall at the foundation. Lily, nestled between them, opened her small paper bag. She broke a single chocolate chip cookie into 3 perfect pieces. She handed one to her daddy, one to Helena, and kept the final, smallest piece for herself. The sharing was complete, voiceover closing the loop. She had all the money in the world. She had all the power, the titles, and the prestige. What she truly needed was one small cookie shared by a child who believed with absolute sincerity that if you just shared a little piece of yourself, you could stay. If you believe stories like this deserve to be told, leave a comment and subscribe to NL Touching Stories. We tell the stories that shouldn't be forgotten.